Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're very pleased to have us all together again this year for the Galien Forum 2023. I'm Mike Rosenblatt. I'm chair of the Pre-Galien USA Award Selection Committee. And in addition to saying welcome, I just wanted to tell you all that we've put a lot of work into organizing this program, and I think it's probably the best ever. We've got a first panel on creating new biopharma companies. We've tried to choose very topical subjects: climate change and public health, mental illness and addiction, AI's impact on health, and obesity. And in addition, we have two very special panels. We're going to have a fireside chat with Alex Gorski, the former CEO of J&J, and we're going to, at the end, collect a group of current CEOs and talk about issues in the industry. So I'm looking forward with you to having a really great day, and we're going to start with a fabulous panel discussion. I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, John Maraganore. John.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. I've been in this room before in different meetings. I think it's a wonderful forum. Of course, the views outside are just glorious, and on a day like this in New York City, it's hard to beat. So it's really great to be here. We're going to focus this panel on a number of interesting topics that may be of interest to you. Obviously, the state of play in biotech. We're going to talk a little bit about science and technology and where we see that going. And we're going to talk a little bit about building new companies in this current environment. So that's the overall agenda. We have a remarkable panel of leaders here on the stage. We have founders, we have entrepreneurs, we have investors. So we have all the ingredients it takes to build a great biotech company. And if we're successful at the end of this panel, we'll actually start a new company together and advance great medicines for patients. So maybe some introductions. I'm John Maraganore. I'm the former CEO of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. Built the company for 20 years, and I'm now doing lots of more grandfatherly things, which is enjoyable. Let's go down the road here. Let's start with Sangeeta.
Great. Hi, I'm Sangeeta Bhatia. I'm an engineer in physician at MIT. I work on nanotechnology and new medicines. I've co-founded 9 companies, and I'm interested in getting other professors to start companies.
Great. My name's Adam Koppel. It's an honor to be here. It's very exciting to see you all. I'm an investor. So I started out as a medical scientist and then moved over, and I've been an investor now at Bain Capital for about 20 years, and part of a group called the Bain Capital Life Sciences Fund. So we're entirely dedicated to providing capital for life science companies at points of important inflection, value inflection.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Nally. I'm the CEO of Generate Biomedicines, a company that uses machine learning to understand how proteins function. I joined the organization about 2.5 years ago after having spent 18 years at Merck. It's nice to be here with everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daphne Zohar. I'm the founder and CEO of PureTech Health. We're a biopharmaceutical company that has a new model for developing medicines. We've now advanced 27 new therapeutics and therapeutic candidates, of which 2 have been approved by the FDA, and a 3rd has just filed.
And we'll come back and learn a little bit more about what these wonderful panelists are doing. But let's kick it off a little bit and talk about the current state of play in biotech, in starting new companies, in the environment. You know, I was at a STAT conference last week and commented a little bit about the environment and declared it to be perhaps the worst ever, which is not particularly exciting. But that's related to the capital side of it. Of course, I think on the science side of it, it's the best ever at the same time. So with those 2 extremes, let's hear how all of you are thinking about the current environment, and we'll just go down the road for now, but we're hopefully going to be interspersing very shortly. So Sangeeta,
yeah,
your view.
I like that frame, is the best and the worst. I think, the best is that it's a time of convergence. You've all heard that word, where engineering and physical sciences and chemistry and medicine and computation are coming together. And it's allowing us to imagine just whole new, whole new things, whole new categories of medicines. So that's incredibly exciting. The receiving end of that for starting new companies is probably the worst of times. We were just talking in the back about how when you start a company, it's always preclinical stage, right? And in this current moment where there's a lot of clinical stage assets out there, it's really hard to get people to kind of invest in that, a brand new idea, especially when it's disruptive. So it's like, well, what is it? Is it a software? Is it a device? Is it is it therapeutic? And sometimes it's just a brand new capability. And you don't know yet what the business model is going to be. So the science is very exciting, and the sort of docking into the ecosystem is challenging at the moment.
Yeah. All right. So now, Adam, do you find this like such an exciting time because you've got capital and things are really cheap? And you can buy low, right? I mean, is this...
John, you know me all too well. No, I actually think this is amongst the most exciting time to be an investor that I've been around. And I like to paraphrase, I won't say quote because I'll get it wrong, but I'm going to paraphrase this small investor that I know in Omaha, Nebraska, a guy named Warren Buffett. And he says, look, when you think you're comfortable going to bed at night, that's when you ought to be awfully worried. And when you're stressed out of your mind when you go to bed at night, that's when you ought to be active and being an investor. I think this is an extraordinary time. Look, it's much better to be an investor when the secular trends are extremely strong and the cycle's at a low. And that's exactly where I think we are. I mean, John, you alluded to it. I can't think of a more exciting time from a secular perspective. The science that is going on now is amongst the best we've had. We've had billions of dollars, public and private dollars, that have gone in the last 2 to 3 decades to really improve our basic sciences. And now's the time that's really being translated. It's now applicable to the human condition. And we've seen many, many examples of it. I'll even just point to one that we saw last month with the Nobel Prize going in medicine and physiology for the mRNA vaccine to 2 people from the University of Pennsylvania. That was work that was done 20 years ago. Obviously, it became really practical for all of us 2 or 3 years ago. So that's just one example, and I think that that is a huge secular driver. Also, the fact that we have such a great ecosystem of terrific, large biopharma companies that have already established, global infrastructure for sales, marketing, manufacturing, and distribution, but what we need is innovation. And this is a time of innovation to keep that strong. So I'm highly constructive on that. So what's the problem? The problem is that we've seen the XBI as one proxy go from 174 back in late 21 to 65, I think, as of last night, right? So that's a 60-ish% reduction, right? Well, generally, I've been taught when prices are lower, it's a good time to buy. We also have many fewer investors in the market. So those that are focused here, this community, I think the opportunity, the risk-reward opportunity here is as good as I've seen it. So I'm quite constructive.
Yeah, that's great. Mike and Daphne, Mike and Daphne both from the perspectives of leaders of companies and leaders of entrepreneurial efforts. What's your view of the current state of the environment?
Well, I think, I'll echo what you've already heard. I mean, in many respects, the science is better than it's ever been. And that is true across domains. I think Sangeeta said something that's really important around the interdisciplinary nature of the work that's going on. You're starting to see people from multiple different domains tackle challenges that we haven't been able to address historically. From a company perspective, it's hard right now. There had been an overexuberance in biotech in the 2020-2021 period that led to starting too many companies chasing the same idea. The world doesn't need the 6th-in-class medicine. And that was very, very prevalent for a long period of time. And unfortunately, the downstream impacts of that were that talent was way too dispersed. Expectations grew out of line. And ultimately, success in this space comes down to accumulating great people to tackle a fundamental challenge. And we had tidal inflation unlike ever before in biotech. I think one of the benefits of this current downturn is you're seeing that come back to the norm. And I think, from my perspective, you're now able to find better and better people to tackle these challenges than you've ever been able to, because so many people have rushed in on the gold rush in biotech. I think there was a bit of inflation, and now it's normalizing. And I think that's going to be really, really impactful for the next 10, 20 years. And if you just look at the history of industries, some of the greatest companies are always born in these sort of downturns. You look at the tech space. Most of the tech giants were born during the financial crisis, during the internet boom, and bust. And those companies are the ones that persist. And I think there's going to be a similar trend here where, in some ways, the survival of the fittest emerge from this current downturn, and you're going to see some amazing companies be born that will be transcendent for human health.
You know, Mike, the Alnylam was born in 2002.
Exactly.
At the end of the last big tech bubble burst, and couldn't agree with you more. And sometimes where you get started and how the company gets funded in the cycle of where the markets are is actually a pretty critical part of getting it right ultimately.
Yeah.
Hard to predict.
Totally.
But it, you know, sometimes that timing can be everything.
It brings a grit and a resourcefulness that it maybe wasn't present a couple of years ago.
That's right. And as opposed to starting and getting too big and then having to go backwards, you can actually build in the right environment with the right time frame.
Absolutely.
No doubt. What about you, Daphne?
So we built PureTech with very little resources, and so we're very comfortable in a scenario where you have to, be tight with your cash. I mean, we have a person full-time that just files for grants. We constantly look for non-dilutive funding. We've been able to generate cash such that we haven't had to raise capital on the capital markets for over 6 years, which is a great position to be in. With that said, so I think it's a very exciting time to be developing new medicines, and it's exciting to be able to get those medicines to patients. But I think we have a morale issue in the industry broadly, and I also think we have some existential issues that relate to how we develop these new medicines. And so we need to develop and address those with new models. But we talked about being a CEO running a company right now. And it's tough because it doesn't matter how much good work you're doing. It's just a tough environment. And I think we have a number of headwinds that we've been facing from IRA, FTC, even things that are like threats to the IP. So threats to some of the fundamental building blocks of the ecosystem. And we need to figure out a way through this. And I agree with you that there is a sort of rich get richer phenomenon. So there's companies that are doing really well, that are thriving in this environment. But there's also a tremendous amount of destruction. A lot of companies are going out of business. I think there's been like 147 bankruptcies or something like that. And
hundreds of companies trading under cash.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And companies trading under cash, lots of people doing reductions in force. So it's not a great time for biotech, like morale in general.
Okay, so now Daphne, but you've been so successful in raising capital and through different cycles over the years. How have you done it? And then Mike, you just raised some capital, right? And love to hear from both of you in terms of how that went, or how you've done it historically, Daphne, and Mike more recently, how that went.
Yeah, so one of our core values, we have a few core values, obviously patients first, but one of them is being entrepreneurial and scrappy. And so we started PureTech with very little funding, and what we did was we would put the IP that we were developing, the new medicines, in subsidiary companies and raise capital for those. So basically partner our programs with investors in order to advance them. And that model has enabled us to generate non-dilutive cash. So we've generated about $800 million in cash over the last 3 years. But I would say that in general, it's not a great time to be fundraising. So we were lucky that we were able to do non-dilutive funding. I also think that by advancing medicines in this sort of hub and spoke model, there's some advantages in diversification of risk and being able to share resources across multiple projects, so not sort of build empires, but have one group that's managing across multiple programs. There are a number of advantages. One of the biggest disadvantages, I think, from a funding perspective, is that investors tend to like sort of more binary companies where there's more of a potential threat of acquisition, though I would say that that's probably just more of a perception.
And Mike, you just raised some capital. Tell us how that went. Tell us how much did you raise again?
So we just finished our Series C financing. We raised $280 million. We were extraordinarily fortunate, I think. In hindsight, you can kind of look at these things and be pretty objective about it. We when we raised our Series B financing, we did so at the height of the market, right, in 2021. And we were fortunate that we had 16 amazing investors that came into that, covering the gamut of sovereign wealth funds, state pension funds, large academic endowments, big mutual funds, that ultimately provided us a foundation and support to go forward. And I think a huge part of the reflection that I've had since this most recent round was when we raised in 2021, we did not mention a single pipeline program. It was a platform investment. People were buying into the fact that would machine learning or generative AI ultimately disrupt drug discovery? Today, we got basically zero value for the platform. And every conversation was on how is the platform translating into products that make a difference in this world. And so I would say almost entirely our valuation in this round was based on that translational factor. And we were fortunate that we were able to advance 2 programs, one into the clinic, one where the IND or CTA has just recently been filed, that ultimately gave people a sense of the underlying value of the platform. We're working on 17 different programs right now. We were fortunate to have a partnership with Amgen, a partnership with MD Anderson, and I think a big part of it, John, was being able to deliver on the milestones you had laid out. Yeah. And I think right now, if you stumble, people are looking for reasons not to invest, not finding reasons to invest. And you have to be very disciplined because a lot of times in this industry, people have overpromised and underdelivered. Delivery and execution is really, really important right now. And sometimes we all know that there's a bit of serendipity to the sport. Inevitably, drug discovery and development is an up and down game. And if you catch the wrong break, I think a lot of great companies will actually be stranded during this period. And so, to me, a lot of this is around how do you focus your team on execution, on delivery, to get through a period where you can then ultimately have programs that people like Adam can value very, very clearly.
Yeah. So Adam, did you invest in Mike's company?
I did not.
Okay, all right.
It was a mistake.
You're lost.
It was a mistake. You're lost. I will in the future.
You're lost. But
Good answer.
How do you think about this right now? Because, again, you talked a little bit about this amazing opportunity from an investor perspective,
Yeah.
but when you make the individual company decision of what to invest in and what not to invest in, what are the criteria? What's the magic?
Yeah. Well, after I take my dartboard down, then I think about 3 things, really 3 things that we focus on, to be serious. It's team, it's the balance sheet, and the balance sheet really is 2 things. People call it a balance sheet. It is a lot of times the bank account, the cash, but it's also the assets. Assets sit on the balance sheet. And then third, it's the plan that management puts in to how to use the cash to best develop the assets. Those are the 3 things that we talk about. And I'm kind of reminded, a lot of you have already alluded to this point, but I was in France a few years ago, and I love going to France, and I was in the vineyards in France, and I had this winemaker use this great line that I use now pretty regularly, and I talk to my team about it all the time. He said, the great years of wine, the great vintages of wine are times when the vines were stressed. So we always say, stress the vines to make great wines. Yeah. That was kind of a line I took away when I was in the vineyards. And I think there's a lot of that in the biopharmaceutical and life sciences industry. And you guys have alluded to it. We believe when we invest, when capital is easy to come by, when you can overvalue and overcapitalize companies, a lot of times you don't see the best outcomes. It's when you stress companies, you identify the best managers, and then you have those managers really identify the most efficient and effective way to allocate that capital on the best assets, and go with the best KOLs to develop the drugs. That's when you make great. That's when you make great companies. And so that's what I want to say. That's what we do, right? We really look for. You have to start with a strong management team, a management team that you can trust, that will allocate the risk capital as well as they can, that will identify the best plans to execute on the most interesting assets. And I'd say the conundrum now really is around balance sheet. So I want to make one more point around the cash side of the balance sheet and where the cash account would be. What we found in the last 6 years is companies where you had to take balance sheet risk did not do well. And it was unfortunate. So a lot of investors will just say, let's give the minimum amount of capital we can to get the very specific catalyst, but they may not be the true value-creating catalysts. So we've kind of changed our thinking a bit from an investor perspective. And we recognize that we need to make sure that we don't overcapitalize a company, because as we said, that leads to problems, and that does not lead to critical thinking by a management team if they have too much capital. But you also don't want to leave a company at the whim of the markets, depending on where those markets will be in the future. So you have to use other tools to both fully capitalize them to get to a true value-creating event, but also make sure that they're not overspending or spending just on platform value that won't become tangible in the near term. And so there are tools to do that now, and I think you're seeing that in some of the term sheets that are coming through. I don't want to get too specific.
Well, get a little bit more specific. So what are some of the tools?
So some of the tools that people are now using is tranching and is convertible preferreds. And so I'll just talk about tranching in this discussion, which is you want to say, okay, you're going to need, I'm going to make these numbers up, you're going to need $200 million to get to a true value creating point, to actually get that phase 2B data, that randomized controlled phase 2B data, where you can show that competitive intensity, doesn't matter, we're going to beat it. Show that there's a risk of a liver function test, doesn't matter. We're going to power it to power through a regulator's concern about a liver function test. Whatever it is you need to fully create value from an asset. But you may put in the dollars and say 200 total, but you're going to start with 59. And what we're going to want to see is your phase 2A data. And we're going to want to see you achieve A, B, and C, a certain amount of activity, a certain amount of safety, a certain amount of tolerability. And then from there, if things meet a certain basic criteria, we will unlock the rest. But you will not have to worry about going back to the capital markets. And I think that combination of both making sure that a management team stays focused on the actual value-creating events that you need for all the constituents, the payers, the regulators, the adopters, the investors, the patients. So you keep those stakeholders in mind with every decision you make, but at the same time, not leave a management team to the whims of uncertainty if the capital markets aren't going to be as friendly or as open in the near future. So that's how we focus.
Yeah. Hey, Adam, do you ever find that these tranches create a false sense of security to the management team? Because if something goes just a little bit wrong, then they haven't really planned for it, and I don't know what you see in terms of the tranches and
yeah, I mean, our experience has been, even when we use a tranche, even if a management team doesn't hit on exactly the pre-specified criteria that's written in a term sheet, the investor wants it to work as well. The investor doesn't want to write down their initial tranche as well. So you are kind of aligned incentives, but I think it does focus. So
how many times have you not tranched?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it depends on the investor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's why. But then that's why a counterparty needs to invest with investors that are going to support them and be the partner in defining what those criteria are. We've done this a lot. In the last 2 years, we've basically tranched almost every deal we've done.
But how many have you not?
I can't think of an example yet.
But
things are still playing out. I mean, there's one example of a situation where there was a I mentioned liver function test because that's always that thing out of left field. There was an example where there was some liver toxicity. Look, I think it's in everybody's interest. If you see a signal and you say you should not proceed, it is not safe to proceed, I think it's in everyone's best interest to reallocate that.
But Adam, you can't put those conditions in a hot market.
Exactly.
You will be outcompeted for capital.
No, 100%.
Massively.
And that's why in 2019, 20, and the first 7 months of 2021, you weren't getting those terms.
That's
but those are the companies that are struggling right now.
I agree.
Because then they went with hot term sheets where people didn't really do diligence. They just threw money at a management team. Management teams didn't have the full experience to know how to manage through a downturn, and they're stuck. And that's why I think the point that you made, Alnylam was started in a very challenging time in the market because you had dedicated investors with kind of focused capital allocation that partnered with management to really get a plan that everyone could be behind.
But the other side of that, Adam, is if you have the best management team, they should be able to make those trade-offs without those explicit guidance. I mean, and that's right. Because in some ways, these terms that you're putting in are a lack of trust.
No, it's not a lack of trust. It's providing the focus for a company written down in paper and getting aligned agreement early on that what is the most important place to allocate capital.
So I love the tension you're seeing here on the stage between the
this is real.
company owner and the trancher, or the investor rather. But it is a real. But it gets back a little bit to what Daphne said about just being in that gritty environment, right, and the benefits of being in that gritty environment when you're trying to build a company. Sangeeta, I mean, let's come to you. First of all, Adam's company should have used your technology to figure out if there were liver toxicities.
yes.
So you guys should talk
We have a predictive tool for that.
after the meeting. But I mean, you've been such an incredible academic leader, and you've been a founder of multiple companies. How do you think about this current environment in terms of being a founder?
Yeah.
And I mean, there must be enormous frustration given the quality of the science coming out of your lab. But give us some feelings about it.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this moment is, and I want to share with all of you kind of the view from the academy and the people coming into this industry, is that it's a very different time than it was a few years ago, and trainees are have other choices. So, I mean, in the U.S., there's unionization of PhD students. They are politically active. These are students that are used to using their voices, and they are used to asking for what they want, and they're impatient. And if you tell an undergraduate, you have a choice between a biology PhD and a 5-year postdoc, and then you're going to go into biotech and climb up the ladder, and then one day you'll be CSO. Or you can get a 4-year undergraduate degree in AI and graduate with $1 million salary. Like, there are huge disconnects happening in the pipeline. So, we, I think, are all taking for granted that we're going to get the best and the brightest. We're making medicines. We save lives. But actually, especially in this convergent era where health and tech are connected, we are being chosen or not chosen all the time. And so some of the tension that I also see is, PhD students want to graduate, they want to be co-founders, they want to be CSO on day one. And you're like,
So can we just pause on that issue, because it's an area of passion for me. I mean, it is insane to think that these young people so early in their careers can go on to operating roles and leadership roles, and I mean, how do you advise them on that side of it?
Honestly, it's a bit of a negotiation.
Yeah.
I mean, so the carrot is, it's very rare in your life that you discover something and you get to join the thing that makes it a medicine.
Yeah.
Right? So that's usually the conversation that we're having. And making drugs is a field, and you have to learn on the job, and you'll be recognized. But it is a tense conversation. I have, some of my 2/3 of my 100 trainees have not chosen biotech. Right? They make lots of other choices. Some of them are straight up tech. Some of them are in venture. The number who become operators are not that many.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, it almost seems like every graduate thesis these days needs to be a company in the minds of these, PhD students. And I can tell you, my graduate thesis work should never have been a company. It was never a company, and should never have been a company, right?
Well, and I think you want to preserve that, right?
Yes.
You want that PhD to be scholarly activity and not buffeted by the winds of the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
But they're out there in it. We're sitting in the middle of Cambridge in our case.
Do you see it changing given this capital markets environment? I mean, hopefully it does, and presumably it's not as easy for them to raise the money and frolic into CEO land right after their degree.
What I see is that they're completely shifting out of biotech. So, which, that kind of breaks your heart. They say, that is very hard.
Interesting.
I'll
Mike,
make a new app, right?
Yeah, okay.
So when I joined Generate, there were about 100 people in the world that were well-versed in the skills of machine learning and protein engineering. And the race for that talent was so extraordinary. And the people that were actually the most successful were Google DeepMind, Microsoft Research, Facebook. Salesforce had a protein team.
Oh.
Wow.
I'm trying to think who else. But it was all large tech. NVIDIA has a big group as well.
Yeah.
So you're in this world where people with basically unlimited cash flow can almost do these side projects that are disconnected from an economic reality, and that's where a lot of the best minds were going. And fortunately, supply and demand starts to correct. We've seen a massive swing now in terms of the number of people being trained in that multidisciplinary manner, and at the same time, the people that we try and find are those that aren't trying to do this for the next click. but that wanted to do this to save lives.
Yeah.
And so that sense of purpose is extraordinarily strong. But for a while, we had to break all of our salary bands.
Yeah.
We couldn't compete if we didn't. And it's hard when you have someone sitting there saying, this is the offer from Google.
Yeah, 2 years before they graduate.
Totally. Exactly.
They don't put their
Nope.
they don't put the emails
Don't
on
even
the
care.
website anymore.
That's right.
Because they get offers.
But you're starting to see it recalibrate.
Yeah.
We had
bet you it will.
5 interns in our machine learning group this summer. We had 1,200 applicants. And so you started to see this massive tide shift where there's this group that realized they can do cutting edge machine learning in the context of a company that's trying to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's switch from the environment to the science. We talked a little bit about the science, and I think everybody agrees that it's at an incredible moment of time in terms of the pace of discovery and where science and medicine are going. But where do you all, what really in that fabric of excitement? I mean, what gets you the most excited? And Sangeeta, you should start. What's driving your excitement these days on the science side?
Well, so my lab is in a cancer center, and every floor is half engineers and half cancer biologists. So, we recognize that 2/3 of cancers are cured if you find them early. So finding lethal cancers early and intercepting them, whether it's by vaccines or interacting with the immune system, and doing it not just in developed countries but around the world, to us, that is the grand challenge of this chapter. And there's so many exciting things happening in that space. It's just one example.
Yeah, fantastic. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of areas. I mean, I guess the trends that my team and I are focused on right now is the practical applicability, right? Because that's where there's been so many great decades of basic science. It's where can we actually see the impact on the human condition? I would say we have shifted our thinking. I think post-pandemic, we really shifted our thinking to saying, what are the diseases that affect all of us, not just the diseases that affect 500 people around the world. So we definitely have had a shift there, and I'm really heartened to see so many great advances in recent years on some of the big diseases, on some of the big cardiovascular diseases and respiratory diseases and inflammatory diseases, and neuroscience and neuropsych diseases, right? I think if you really look at the last 10 years, I think we've made as much impact there as we did on the ultra-rare, ultra-orphan diseases, which seem to have been in vogue in the previous decade. So that's one area that I think we are kind of reshifting our thinking. The second thing, though, is I think
more of a sort of almost a public health orientation, which
because as there's a focus, there's a public policy focus on our pricing, and I don't want to get into that at all, but I do think we ought to kind of think about where can we do the most good for our entire culture and society, not just for very small numbers, because there may be a perception that we can have a 10-patient open label phase 1 study and go to regulators and say, oh, we should get approved. I think we move too far in one direction. The second major area for me is, look, I think biology's been great. I think biology is pacing ahead. Our understanding of biology may even be pacing ahead in our ability to interrogate and modify that biology. So one of the areas that we're really focused on is delivery, right? You did that. I think a major success story of Alnylam was around the delivery. So we're looking at a lot of the companies that can get drugs to the right place at the right time and the right people, also identifying who are the right people that need it. And it's not just about organ system and tissue, it's about where in the tissue. I mean, I'm excited about a number of companies that are really focused not just on making sure we get things into the brain, let's say, or into the kidneys, but where within the cell does that drug need to get to have its function. So those are kind of the two areas that we are really focused on right now.
Cool, that's great. Mike?
So
I think it's probably
you have a probably good sense of where this is going to go. But over the past 20 years since I've been part of the industry, the thing that's troubled me the most is, despite the fact that we have been staring biology in the eye for all of our existence, we understand so little. Basically, what I came to believe was that this intersection of science and technology will help us understand biology in ways the human mind alone could never understand it. And I think there's been fundamental challenges in terms of how we measure biology. But what we're starting to see is this intersection creating insights that I believe will allow us to program medicines over the course of the next 20 years. We are starting to understand the code both from a DNA and RNA perspective, and now from a protein perspective, that allows us to basically start to say, I want these interventions with these sort of features. And we're very early in that journey, so don't get me wrong to suggest that this code is cracked and now we understand 100% of biology. This is a transitional point where today we may understand about 5% of biology and we may go to 10% of biology, but that will be transcendent for the human condition. And just simple things like a decade ago, it would have taken the world's fastest supercomputer 100 years to train our core model. Now we do it on AWS almost instantaneously. Just computing.
Yeah.
Data is starting to emerge, and we're capturing data in a much more rigorous way. We invest heavily in automation and microfluidics to have very precise measurement. If you think about the variability of assays across companies, a lot of the data we've captured is entirely inconsistent. It doesn't lend itself toward machine learning-based approaches. That's starting to change. So I think there's a huge frontier here where we are going to start to understand this code. And what that ultimately suggests is a sport that we've all played for a long time that has been trial and error will increasingly become engineerable. And when things become engineerable, you start to be more deterministic. And that's really exciting for all of the work we're doing, I think, across all of the companies. And I don't think a company can be born without a computational foundation going forward. I think it's going to be increasingly more and more difficult to start companies without it.
So let's come back to that, because I think it's a very important and hot and exciting area. But before we do that, Daphne, what about you? What do you sort of see in the frontiers of science and medicine that excites you the most these days?
Yeah, it's actually a topic that we've touched on a few times here, and that is that in our industry, we'll spend 10 years figuring out the basic science, translational stuff, and then get to a human study, and then something will work actually in humans, but there'll be some issue with it, like liver tox or some other issue that holds back the development of that drug. And I think that one thing that I'm really excited about and we're doing at PureTech is applying today's technology and thinking to solve the problems that might have been insurmountable in the past. And one of the areas that I'm really excited about doing that is in mental health, CNS-related disorders broadly. And we did that with a program that is now just filed for FDA approval in schizophrenia. And it's going to be, if approved, the first new mechanism for treating schizophrenia in over 50 years. Now, initially, you could look at it and say it was an old drug. It was sitting on a shelf at Eli Lilly.
Right.
But there was some really exciting efficacy data, and we were able to solve that. And we have a technology, actually, Adam, you'll like this, that helps to overcome liver tox issues. And so going forward, one of the things that we're doing is applying that to a number of really interesting, we think, programs that should be developed, should reach patients. So that's something I'm excited about. It may not sound as sexy, but I actually think that from a patient perspective, it could be incredibly important.
And these are all in the neuropsych type setting or mental health type setting?
Well, that's one area where we
Yeah.
think that there's utility, and also the translation rates from preclinical to clinical are so poor.
Yeah.
So if you can start, and our understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease is so bad that if you can start with human efficacy data, you're going to be in a much better position than starting with mouse data. So,
Yeah.
No doubt.
but we have a platform that applies more broadly. Internally, we're applying it mostly to CNS disorders.
Okay, so let's now, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So let's now change to talk a little bit about AI and machine learning, and Mike touched on it. How far away are we from being able to go to a computer, type in Charcot-Marie tooth, and have the computer generate a small molecule intervention toward the target of interest that can then be synthesized, manufactured, and distributed to patients around the world? What do you guys think?
Sounds like that Star Trek episode.
Yeah, exactly. No, but more seriously, I mean, I'm trying to really get at, I think, Mike, you said we're at 5% understanding and we want to get to 10%.
Yeah.
So where is the scope of this transformation, and what's the reality here? What's the hype here? Where where do we ultimately land over the next 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, right?
Well, I think, much like many of these fields where you start to have kind of the flavor of the day, there's a lot of vaporware in AI ML drug discovery, right? A lot of companies have now rebranded themselves to be AI ML companies, and they're not. And so I think that actually does a disservice to those that are actually trying to do it with real rigor. So I think what you're going to see, and what we're starting to see already, is even where you have great technology foundations, one of the biggest refrains I heard in the fundraising cycle was these companies don't understand biology.
Yeah.
So they may have a really good insight that gets you to a good molecule, but look at the indications they're choosing. Look at how they're trying to prosecute it.
Yeah.
Look at the failure. Look at the dosing. They totally missed the PK/PD. And so, in many ways, this is an intersection of technology with, the real rigors of drug discovery.
Yeah.
Much of that hasn't been sorted. And so this idea that we're going to come out and, you just think about it from a regulatory perspective, like the FDA is going to sit there and say, well, this molecule is perfect out of a computer.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly not in my lifetime.
That's right.
The question becomes, can we get to better answers in a more productive way? And I think that is what we're starting to see, that you can get to really productive answers very, very quickly, and answers that you couldn't get through traditional approaches. I mean, one of the things that, one of our board members is a lady named Frances Arnold, and Frances, shares with me often, like, nature has sampled 1 drop of water in all the Earth's oceans of proteins.
Yeah.
You just think about the combinatorial space. Say the average protein is about 200 amino acids long, 20 natural selections, 20 to the 200th power, atoms in the universe cubed, combinations, right? The idea that nature has found the best answer consistently, when our own bodies will basically create somewhere around 10 to the 12th antibodies, there's no way.
Yeah.
And so can we find better answers? Of course we can find better answers. Do we have to be very thoughtful about how we find those better answers? Because things that haven't been harnessed by the immune system may be immunogenic. Yeah.
Yeah.
But these are things that we're starting to be able to tackle. And again, it's the early days.
Yeah.
But I think there's so many areas of profound unmet medical need that if we can start picking that fruit, we're going to be able to do a lot, with these technologies going forward.
Sangeeta, what do you think? I mean, you must, at MIT, you must see so many cool things. So what do you think?
I think, it's interesting. So there's been, an era of molecular medicine. And in some ways, I think computation is now allowing us to come back to physiology, right? It's not just the sequence or just the protein, but how are the cells connected? What are all the cells? And how are they distributed? How do we traffic to each and every one? That's a multi-scale computational problem. I mean, and just to give you a sense, when I came into the field, when I started, we said there were 282 cell types in the body. That's what we said. And that was the atlas. And some of you may have seen last week, there was a set of papers that came out on the human brain. 3,000 types of neurons in the human brain alone, right? How are they connected? What are they all doing? How do you get a genomic medicine into each and every one, and how would it affect the system? Right, those are the challenges that I think computation is going to be a critical tool for.
Yeah, and ultimately it'll have to be reduced down to, real things, right? And
Totally.
I mean, what do you, Daphne, Adam, on this topic? Your thoughts?
On reducing, sorry, what was the
Machine learning and AI, and is it real? Is it hype? Is it, and how? Where is it in the spectrum of impact?
Well, I mean, I think that it's definitely real. There's definitely also hype around it right now, and that's unfortunate. But we had a nice discussion with Andy Plump and Jay Bradner and Matai Mamin, and they've been they're doing some amazing things, or they were. I mean, at their respective institutions with AI for years now, and so I think that there are some real companies and that are doing really important work, but also this label is a bit is being used too much, I think, too cynically right now. So,
Yeah, I'm pretty naive on the topic, but I will say this. I think there's a lot of hype, but I agree with Mike. I think the tools can be very powerful if the right questions are asked and the right priorities are set. It reminds me a bit of, again, going back to when you started on Alnylam of the turn of the millennium back in 99, 2000, 2001 with genomics. Right, there were tons of like genomics. If you were a company and you had the word genomics in your strategy, you got funded. And with the exception of Illumina, I can't really look back and say any of the companies that called themselves genomic companies, one of which I know you know very well, that really succeeded because they were genomics companies. Yet when I look back over the top selling 20 drugs, every single one of them needed the tools of genomics to be developed, discovered and developed.
Yeah.
So I think back then, genomics was an incredibly powerful tool. Every company had to use it, but it was more a ticket to play than it was an investment thesis or strategy for a company to kind of build itself around. I think similarly now about AI and ML. I mean, of course, AI is important, right? You know, I'll quote one of the mentors that I have in the industry that says, you know, he's not really sure it's artificial, nor is it intelligent, but it is doing something. I won't quote that person, but I saw his boss was here last night. I saw, so I think, and this is a gentleman that has made drugs actually. So I think that the tools of AI are incredibly important. I think obviously we should be using the tools of AI, but I'm not sure that a company that says that they are the AI company or they can build a sustainable moat around the way they're using AI that no one else can use, I'm not so sure that as an investor, we gain comfort around that. And it leads me to this thought around, you know, this disconnect coming from like East Coast, West Coast. It's like a music industry thing. But I think companies that are developed on the East Coast versus the West Coast have a bit of a different perspective on the utility of some of these new tools that we're using. And I think we've all said it up here, drug development and medical device development is really hard. It's complicated. And most things fail. In fact, I'd say probably 95% of things fail from when the projects first start. So there's lots of steps. Now, AI can really help us with some of these steps, but it can't help us with all of these steps. And one of my cautionary tales I think we should all keep in mind is it's not going to alone help us as develop drugs and medical devices. So we have to understand the limitations that it has. But you know, I'm totally constructive on AI and the use and tools of AI. And any company that's not embracing some of these tools probably would also not want to be a company that we would want to invest in.
Yeah. I wanted to add, I think it's interesting, I think in our industry at this moment, we all think we understand generally what AI means to us or what it could mean to us. There are large language models or there's machine learning for large data sets where there is precision data, right? Like we have some sense of like, this is what it's going to mean. But artificial intelligence as a field is growing in just fascinating ways, you know, to understand what it means to be human.
Yep.
And, you know, one of my colleagues in AI and decision making at MIT studies self-motivated autonomy. We usually think about AI like you give a prompt and it like comes back with an answer. So these are machines that are self-motivated. And he puts them in games, like in murder mysteries, and the little agents like learn to lie. And I mean, there's just like all these fascinating things happening in AI that are not exactly what we're talking about here, and they're going to change in the next 3 to 5 years in ways we can't even imagine.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I want to make sure that people in the audience feel free to jump in with questions as we have one over there. Yeah.
Mean Abdir, I worked maybe with 12 of the largest pharmas and also then looked in genomics, multiomics. This is some companies there. I think the biggest issue, and maybe a comment on that, it's not the AI, it's the multiomics or genomics. It's the data that's being inputted in the AI. And unfortunately, what I see is other countries are advancing more than the US because of the regulatory environment in the US, not being able to share the data of the patient population. And I worked in early discovery, I worked in commercialization, so I understand the trials and the due diligence afterwards. So maybe Mike could answer that because I know he mentioned that, or Sangeeta, because I know you mentioned a lot of students are moving into the AI field. So it's not the AI field itself, it's what the data that's being composed of it to get to the regulatory environment.
No, I mean, listen, I agree with what you're suggesting. I mean, the reality is I think there are certain domains where there is more robust data, and there are other domains where the data is more disparate. There are certain pieces that the U.S. is doing okay with. There are other pieces that certainly other countries have a much clearer industrial policy on. We were visited by the Department of National Security last week, and they recognize this is a major threat to the U.S.'s preeminence in biotechnology. You know, they were very clear that they were basically reading a 40-page report that they had drafted internally, suggesting, while the U.S. has been at the forefront of this field basically since its inception, they see this could be a major pivot point because of some of the regulations that are being imposed in other domains.
Sangeeta, do you have a view on this?
No, I agree completely. I think there's another piece, which is that some societies have better, more integrated longitudinal data.
Absolutely.
And what you see is
The Nordics.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was just with Rory College yesterday, and obviously what they've done with the UK Biobank is pretty phenomenal. So it's a good example of a more integrated, less fragmented healthcare system that allows you to collect data in a more meaningful way. Are there other questions? Yes, let's go over here. Yes.
This question is for Adam. It's a very detailed question about hepatotoxicity. I'm kidding.
I got nervous.
Actually, it does come back to something that you said, both you and Sangeeta, about the foundational science that has been going on for 20 years that's now become transformative and translating into products. And you referenced Galien and Drew Weissman, the Nobel Prize. They notoriously had a lot of trouble getting funding and investment. So the question is, there's a lot of exciting science going on now, and it's opening up new discoveries, but one, do we still need to invest? I think the answer probably is yes in the foundational science, but who is that incumbent upon to make those investments? And how do we hone those investments to have better vision as to what will become transformative and translational in the future?
Well, that's a great question. So obviously I agree, yes. Your premise, I strongly agree. We need massive investment, continued massive investment. I think our basic science investment in the last 2 to 3 decades, and probably even before that, has had huge dividends for society. A question about who should benefit from those, from where that investment comes from, that's a different and a very complicated question, which I guess could start teaching to what should we now do in the future, who should be responsible. I think it needs to be public-private collaboration. I think the very successful, massive global biopharmaceutical companies should continue to reinvest in the very basic science, because that creates both the future leaders and the technologies that will be used. But I also think global governments need to do that, because you're not really going to get that investment cycle that would clearly not relevant for what my investors expect out of return profile for me. The question is, are the great venture capital firms that are out there, and we know who they are, and they're terrific. I mean, is it even in their capital cycle to do the 1 to 2 decade investments? I don't know the answer. It's a really good question, but clearly we need a lot more investment. And one other example I'll give, and you asked the question like, I think you kind of alluded, what's really impressed us recently about like new data, and I talked in high level, but there is one other topic I want to say that came out of basic science that surprised me this year. It's the Schett data that came out of Europe and Germany for immune reset, right? That's been stuff that's been, people have been talking about that probably for 2 decades, and it was hitting a wall. Now seeing these lupus patients out of the Schett experience is really remarkable, and seeing now how long out they are with like complete eradication of signs and symptoms of a disease that has haunted society now for so many years. So I mean, that's just another example that comes to mind of something incredibly important that could affect many, many of us. So that's just another example where the basic science is going on for a while. A lot of people didn't want to fund it, but people found a way and they pushed through, and now I think you're seeing incredibly constructive, realistic clinical data.
Sangeeta, you obviously live this, right? So what's your view on this? Because I think
it's a time of experiments.
Yeah.
Federal funding is down, and so we are all experimenting with how to cultivate these early ideas. We have VCs investing directly in innovation funds on campuses. We have pharma creating incubators. We have the venture funds doing the build your own. I think we all know that there's something in the ecosystem. We have the engine, which is at MIT is a long-range LP cycle. So I think we haven't quite figured out. Maybe it's going to be multiple different models, but definitely the current model is not sufficient to feed this generation of innovations.
Interesting. Yeah, Mike.
This is for Sangeeta.
before you get to that, if something's coming out of your lab,
Yes, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the step before company creation. We've heard from Adam and from Daphne how they decide when to invest in a company, but if you have a new technology or a potential product in your lab or a colleague's lab, you're making a decision about whether this should be the basis of a new company or maybe partner it with big pharma or a biotech company. And how do you and your colleagues decide which direction to send one of these new things?
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you for it. I think this is actually a huge efficiency gap in our system. It's very sporadic. Who is connected well enough to the ecosystem to actually call a John, which I've done, and said, is this a company? Is this a license? Is this a shell with a subsidiary? Like, what is the right? Is it even, should I publish 2 more science papers on it before it's the right time? It's actually very human. It's it's kind of an ecosystem web that allows you to make those decisions.
And has the current environment shifted which way you go?
So this is, I think, Daphne said before, the rich are getting richer. People who are better connected are more able to start their own and raise capital through their relationships. And the folks who are not in the conversation, not in the boardroom, don't have that, I think those inventions are actually not getting created, not turning into companies. So one of the things that we're trying to focus a lot on is getting those faculty and those trainees connected to the ecosystem so those inventions can turn into medicines.
Yeah. We have one other question, if we can have the time for one question, and then we'll have to close.
Thanks. I know Adam didn't want to talk about pricing, but the big elephant in the room is the cost of healthcare. And as we think about the cost of drug discovery, that has to be recuperated by someone. It ends up being the patient. And especially when we have venture involved in supporting the cost of drug discovery, they have to recuperate that because they're a business like everyone else. What do you think about innovative models that get venture out of supporting drug discovery so ultimately that cost doesn't get passed on to our patients?
Okay, so that's far from a short.
Put up 60 minutes.
Yeah. But I mean, Daphne and I are on the bio board, so maybe Daphne, you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I mean, we were in D.C. yesterday meeting with senators, congressmen, and one of the things that encouraged me is there's a greater understanding of the role of PBMs and some of the egregious practices that they've been employing. And so I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on transparency around some of their practices, and that should be helpful for our industry. Because I think what people are really worried about is out-of-pocket costs for patients, as opposed to, and sometimes that there's not a direct connection between the out-of-pocket cost for patients and what the drug companies are charging. And really there's this whole complex ecosystem there, where there's middlemen. And so hopefully there will be some pushback on that, and I think that could be a positive.
Yeah, and I would just say that the insurance design in this country has gone from the well subsidizing the sick to one where increasingly the sick are subsidizing the well.
Totally.
And that doesn't make much sense. A patient with cancer shouldn't have to be burdened with a copay. They've got enough burden. They've got cancer, and they should get the right medicine that their doctor prescribes for them, and they shouldn't be asked to subsidize a lower premium for everybody else. So that's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah.
So I think with that, we should end. Thank you.